Let's say China.
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 China. China.
China.
There are no storm movers, and you can actually see Russia from land here in Alaska.
Go over to China.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Trump statement, tweeting out insults to Angela Merkel. What's he doing?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your host.
Yes. Hello, and welcome. I am James Andrews, and you are listening to So This Happened, the only news you need if you just woke up from a coma, which you were in for the last 10 years. What's that? No, George W. Bush is no longer the president. Well, it's not as good as you think. Yeah, well, the president right now is Donald Trump. Yes, that Donald Trump. Yes, no, I'm not joking. No, I'm telling you, Donald Trump is the president of the United States of America. Anyway, it's Wednesday, the 27th of September, 2017, and today, the Republicans presented a new tax plan. And while the details on it are scarce, there are a few things we can point out about it. Now, as would be expected with any tax plan brought about by the Republicans, the corporate tax rate will be cut, and in this particular plan, they're going to cut it to 20%. Now, it's not as much as Donald Trump had said he wanted, but it's still a much lower rate than what they are currently at. And it's also going to eliminate 4 income tax brackets. And there are one or two things in it which actually seem like they might be a good idea. It doubles the standard deduction, and it increases the child tax credit. It also repeals the estate tax, but it keeps the deductions for mortgage interest and charitable giving, and these are two big deductions that a lot of Americans use. Now, I will point out that those particular tax breaks are more commonly used by very wealthy Americans. They're certainly the ones that benefit from it more. If your house is much larger and more expensive, then you're going to be able to take a bigger tax break. In the same way, if you give more money to charity, you're going to be able to also get a bigger tax break on that. Now, the big downside to this plan is that it is expected to cost trillions of dollars, and so far, the Republicans have not said where that money is going to come from, or, more realistically, what is going to get cut so that these savings can go into place. Now, while the Republican senators are saying this is going to be great for all Americans, the Democratic senators are not as convinced. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has called the plan a disappointment, mainly because it deviates from Donald Trump's promise to benefit the middle class. And what Chuck Schumer said was, and I quote, "They raised the bottom rate from 10 to 12%, the lowest rate on the poorest and working class Americans." Then he continued, so what the plan does is the top rate on the wealthiest comes down, and the bottom rate on the working class families goes up. What kind of plan is this? And Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon said that the doubling of the standard deductions is a massive step backwards. And he's saying that because it eliminates personal deductions, and that is how many middle-class families lower their tax bill. And I'm sure many of you listening to me right now, that is how you lower your tax bill, is all the deductions that you're able to take. Well, under this new plan, those deductions will no longer be there. So, well, where's the break for us? And in many ways, it seems that the Republican senators really just want to pass this bill because they fucked up so royally on repealing and replacing Obamacare. It seems like they just want to get a win. Now, Lindsey Graham, the senator for South Carolina, he said that the tax reform is critical for the Republican Party. In other words, he's saying we really need a win because we already didn't repeal and replace Obamacare, which we said we would do. So now we just have to do tax reform. It'll look good on the resume. I'm not entirely sure they're actually looking at it and going, is this really going to help Americans, or is it just going to look good that we actually got something done? Now, that aside, what this plan intends to do is simplify the tax process, and that's always a good thing. When you simplify something, that's good. And to be honest, that will actually benefit working class and middle class people. The simpler it is, the better. If you're extremely rich, you're hiring people to do all your accounting work, and they're going to find every single little loophole that they possibly can. Now, by simplifying that tax code, it makes it so that people who may not have been able to afford accountants to do that for them will now be able to do it on their own. But of course, simplifying the tax rate also will benefit the wealthy, because remember, this is going to drop it to just 3 tax rates, and those tax rates are 12%, 25%, and 35%. So the maximum amount that the super wealthy can be taxed now is 35%, and that is down from 39.6%, which it is right now. So arguably, dropping from almost 40% to 35%, that, depending on how much money you have, is a huge tax savings for the super wealthy. And that is something that the Democrats are going to look at and go, ooh, no. Not happening. Not happening, especially when you're raising the rate on the really poor from 10% to 12%. Not going to fly. Now, arguably, the biggest changes in the tax code with this new bill are the taxes on businesses, and they are significant. The corporate tax rate would be slashed to 20%, and right now it's at 35%, to give you an idea of how big a deduction that is. Now, taxes on small businesses, they would go to 25%. Now, they're currently at 39.6%. So again, a massive deduction on small businesses. And that one, I actually think is quite good. Small businesses, as we know, are very important in America, and reducing the tax burden on them is great. The corporate rate, I'm not so sure about that. These multi-billion-dollar corporations, well, do they really need a 15% tax break? I don't know. I think probably not. And of course, that's not even mentioning this staggering amount of money that the government will lose by doing that. It's estimated that it'll be $1.5 trillion over a decade. And that is just, you can't even get your head around that amount of money. But that $1.5 trillion has to come from somewhere. And of course, this is just day one. We really have no idea what will end up in this plan when it comes time to vote. It's going to shift, it's going to change considerably. But this is sort of a first look at what it's going to do. And I'll say again, there are some good things in it, and there are some bad things in it. And I hope that the good things stay and the bad things get cut. But I'm not that optimistic, to be honest. And now moving on to my favourite punching bag state, Alabama. Yesterday there were 2 candidates who were fighting for a place in the Senate. There was Luther Strange and there was Roy Moore. Donald Trump decided that Luther Strange was the man for the job, and he endorsed him significantly on Twitter and in speeches. Unfortunately for the president and for Luther Strange, he lost yesterday. Roy Moore became the Republican senator. Now, Donald Trump had sent a few tweets out during the day about Mr. Strange. One of them said, "He is the man for the job and he will never let you down." In another tweet, he said, "Vote today for Big Luther." Well, he's since deleted those tweets because, well, they're quite embarrassing, aren't they, when, as the president, your endorsement means absolutely jack shit to the people of Alabama. Now, the idea of Donald Trump backing a loser may put a smile on your face, and that's great. Let that smile be there for just a moment. But don't forget, the man who won, Roy Moore, is, well, a very scary individual, and shame on you, people of Alabama, for electing such a bigot to the Senate. Let's have a look at Roy Moore, shall we? Now, to give you an indication of where Roy Moore's politics lie, have a listen to his acceptance speech from last night and pay particular attention to who he thanks for being there.
Nigel Farage, thank you for coming. Steve Bannon, thank you for coming. That is really an outstanding man. I could tell you he is an outstanding man. He gave me more encouragement than anybody this whole time, and I talked to him once on the telephone and once in person. He's a wonderful person. Phil Robertson? Wow. You know, I heard something about Phil Robertson, and I think he's gone, so I can tell it. He's not here now. You know, there were some guys come down, a lawyer came down from up north, New York, big guy, and he was going to do some duck hunting. And so he got near Mr. Robertson's properties and shot a duck, and it fell over in a field. And so he said to himself, I guess I'd go over the field and over the fence and get my duck. But he didn't know it was Mr. Robertson's property. And so he started over and he picked up his duck, and here comes Phil Robertson out with a shotgun. And he said, what are you doing? He said, the lawyer said, well, I'm getting my duck. Phil Robertson says, that ain't your duck. That's my duck. That's my field. And he didn't know who Phil Robertson was, of course. And he said, hey, look, man, he says, I am a rich New York lawyer. I've got a big firm. I could sue you. I could take your farm, your gun, and everything you got. Of course, he didn't know Phil Robertson. He probably had more than the lawyer did. But Phil Robertson just said, well, you ain't in New York. You're down here. And we don't do things that way. And the lawyer said, what do you mean you don't do things that way? He said, well, we don't go to court down here. We got a 3-kick rule. And the lawyer says, what do you mean a 3-kick rule? Never heard of that. And Phil said, well, it's easy. I get 3 kicks, you get 3 kicks, I get 3 kicks, and the first one who quits loses. And the lawyer was a big, strong guy, and he looked at Phil and he says, I think I can take this guy. But he didn't know Phil Robertson. So Phil Robertson said, okay, I go first. So Phil hauled off and kicked him right, you know where. And he bent over in pain. And he come up, and Phil Robertson, more agile than he looks, he came up with a snap kick to his chin and knocked him on his back. And the lawyer's thinking he's about dead, till Phil walked over and kicked him in the side. And he thought he was going to die, but the guy started feeling good. And so he got a smile on his face because it was his turn. He got up and he said, okay, farmer, it's my turn. Phil Robertson said, oh no, I quit. You can get your duck.
Okay, so I played a little bit more of that than I was going to initially, but he was telling such a compelling and clearly true story, I thought I'd just let it roll. But anyway, at the beginning there, he mentioned Nigel Farage, and then Steve Bannon, and then Phil Robertson. Now, if you're thinking that maybe this was just like a Xenophobes of the World Unite conference rather than an acceptance speech to the Senate, you would not be, well, you wouldn't be wrong, would you? Then he went on to tell a story about some city slicker from New York coming down here, you know, and we just beat the shit out of him. Then he told a story which just involved, violence against somebody for no reason. Anyway, that aside, let's very briefly look at some other things that Roy Moore is famous or perhaps infamous for. Now, he was the Chief Justice of an Alabama Supreme Court, but he was suspended from his job twice, actually. Now, the first suspension came in what we'll call the Ten Commandments controversy, and this was back in 2003, when Roy Moore disobeyed a federal judge's order to take down a 5,200-pound statue of the Ten Commandments from the lobby of the State Judicial Building. Roy Moore had campaigned that the monument would stay because God's law will be publicly acknowledged in our court. His words. Now, you may be forgiven for thinking that, is this Sharia law? You know, the thing that everybody on that side is so angry about, that God is in charge of the courts. No, this is a different God, so it's okay for that God to be in charge of the laws. If it's a Muslim God, fuck, no, that's scary, man. But if it's my God, he can be in charge of the courts, no problem. Anyway, Roy Moore was suspended as justice for doing that, and ultimately the statue was removed. Now, his second suspension came in 2012 when he ignored the Supreme Court's view on same-sex marriage. Roy Moore didn't like that at all and said that, no way, not in my court. And his argument for that was, and I quote, "We've got to remember that most of what we do in court comes from some scripture or is backed by scripture." Well, the Supreme Court disagreed and he was ousted permanently in 2016. Some of the things he said is that Islam is a false religion. That was one that he said recently. That was a good one. And he's also celebrated by some evangelicals. Franklin Graham of the Billy Graham Institute loves him, loves the fact that he's got guts. So you know that if Billy Graham's son is saying you're a great man, you're a fucking nightmare. Anyway, listen, unfortunately we're out of time and we could stay here all day and trash Roy Moore. The man is living in a different century. The whole idea of separation of church and state, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a constitutional thing, has completely bypassed him to the point where he's saying, no, God's law is the law of this court. And I'll say again, that sounds very similar to Sharia law, which he says is a false religion. Maybe he's just annoyed because in some of those Muslim countries, Sharia law is actually practiced and he just can't do it here. So he's jealous. That's what it is. He is jealous of the Muslim religion. And on that absolute bombshell, we're going to end the show. So we can continue this on Twitter if you like at So This Happen. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a little review on the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, wherever you're listening to me. Anyway, have a great night, and we will do this all over again tomorrow. Take care.